Dr. Colleen Kraft is Professor of Pediatrics at the Keck School of Medicine, University of Southern California, and Children's Hospital Los Angeles. She is the 2018 past president of the American Academy of Pediatrics. Her work includes integration of behavioral health and team-based care into primary care practice. Dr. Kraft received her undergraduate degree at Virginia Tech and her MD from Virginia Commonwealth University and her MBA from the University of Cincinnati. She completed her residency in pediatrics at Virginia Commonwealth University. As president of the American Academy of Pediatrics in 2018, Dr. Kraft is known for her advocacy to optimize the health of all children through technology and innovation. She serves on the National Scientific Advisory Board of Children and Screens, a nonprofit organization working to uncover the impact of digital media on children and adolescents. Thank you so much, Dr. Kraft, for being here.
Oh, I'm so glad to be here. Thank you.
So, what I'd like to do today at Dopamine, we focus a lot on mental health. But as we know, first of all, there's a connection between mental health and physical health. But I'd like to actually ask you about both today in the context of kids. So, according to a 2023 Mott National Poll on Children's Health, mental health and modern screen technology dominate the top 6 positions for parental concerns. And that surpasses traditional health concerns, including diet, smoking, vaping, even gun violence. So parents listed overuse of devices and screen time as their number one health concern for their children. So are parents' concerns about these issues supported by the latest research and studies?
So they are absolutely supported by the latest research and studies. We get into two things. What do kids do because they're on screens? And what don't they do because they're on screens? So we know that screens can be a very effective way of connection and social connection. And we found this during the pandemic when people couldn't be together. It was a great way to interact with your friends and keep that social connection up there. But we also know that young brains that are developing and their interaction with technology affects that developing brain in ways that it doesn't for those of us who are adults whose brains are pretty much fully developed. We also know that if you're on a screen, you are not doing things like getting together in person with somebody, taking a walk with somebody, being active and outside. And that on a screen, you're more likely to eat junk food and drink things that are not good for you with sugar in them. And so it affects your activity and nutrition. It affects the real important social connection in person that happens. So we're seeing a lot of problems because of what is happening with kids and screens and what kids are doing or not doing because they're on screens.
Yeah, so you touched on this a little bit, but what are the correlations between the use of modern screen tech and kids and their physical health? So you mentioned things like diet habits, right? Or there's studies that connect screen time use to obesity, I believe, right? So
Absolutely.
are
And
there
we
more?
saw exactly during the pandemic, we saw a lot of kids gain a very inappropriate amount of weight. And we saw this from very young ages. We saw 5, 6, 7-year-olds who were gaining weight because they were on screens, not being physically active, making not so great food choices while they were on the screens.
Yeah. And then, I mean, I know this is a little bit older, probably, adolescents, but I mean, I'm pretty sure body image is a big one as well, right?
So body
Obviously,
image is a big one. And it's very interesting because we did see a lot more obesity during the pandemic, but we saw an awful lot more eating disorders
yeah.
and really divided almost equally between males and females. So that's not been a typical pattern for eating disorders. But we saw both of those as well too. And really this had to do with some of the influence of some of the not so great sites and not so great influences through social media.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting that you mentioned men and boys and girls.
Yeah,
I know that traditionally people, and it is probably mostly a young female phenomenon, but I did read recently, and I'm sure this is what you're referring to, that it's the male body image issue is a growing one as well. That's
absolutely.
right? Yeah. Okay. Um, So let's talk about brain development a little bit. The most rapid period of development takes place in early childhood. So that's birth to
Right.
age 5, with the second occurring during adolescence. So, like 10 to 19 is adolescence. So, how do you think technology is affecting the developing mind during these critical moments of growth? You alluded to it in the beginning, but maybe elaborate a little bit more.
So, this is so important to understand why we need to have some limits on screen time and use of digital media for those 10 to 19-year-old kids. The two areas that are really developing are the ventral tegmental area, which is in the midbrain, and then the frontal lobe, which really has everything to do with your executive function, with your ability to hold off on getting rewards until a reward is actually there, on your ability to learn and focus and organize. And so what screens do and what social media does with that developing brain, and what we are finding is that it has effects on that ventral tegmental area, which is kind of like your gas pedal, and then your frontal lobe, which is kind of like your brake. So this is a typical thing that happens when you look at things that make you smile. You're looking at puppies, you're looking at flowers, you're looking at things that generally make you happy. You have some dopamine that becomes present in the ventral tegmental area, and all is good. That's your gas pedal. You're really happy looking at those puppies. You're looking at a site that talks about restricting your eating,
Mhm.
or a site that promotes violence, or a site that talks about experimenting with marijuana or drugs. And your frontal lobe as a teenager is starts off saying, "Oh, this is not good. This is something that's where I've got to put on the brake." But then what happens is this, is that somebody likes that comment. Somebody has a happy emoji on that comment. And what we're learning is that the input and the feedback from other people on these very questionable areas develops that pathway back to the ventral tegmental area. So that takes that teen that first looks at that questionable site and says, "Ooh, I shouldn't be there," to, "Oh, this is really interesting. I maybe
Mhm.
shouldn't be there, but it's really interesting. I want to go back to that eating disorder site. I want to go back to that violence site. I want to go back to that, maybe I'm interested in this drug site." And so what we know is that that interaction with the developing brain really messes up the role of both the amygdala and the ventral tegmental area and the frontal lobe, which should be your brake. And we're seeing kids begin to be interested in some of these sites that are really not good for anybody, but really not good for teenagers.
Yeah, I we talk about the prefrontal cortex a lot in our
Hmm.
work, right? Which is you referred to it as the break, which I love. That's so simple to um, put it that way. One of the things I heard you talk about was this idea of social contagion, right? These are the challenges, but it can also be the harmful content. And I think the way that you described the reason the teens are more susceptible to it is so clear and well put. And the fact that they might even consciously know that it's not good for them, but they literally cannot pump the brakes. Like their brain will not allow them to pump the brakes. And I think that's really important for parents to understand, because even if they think their kid has a great moral compass, and they probably do, they just might not be capable of stopping whatever it is. Right? Is am I on the
Because
right
this is
track?
happening while that brain is developing. So if you
Yeah.
think about it, like train tracks, an
Yeah.
adult has those train tracks that have been set down, that have been laid, that are really put into place. That adolescent, you're building those train tracks. And so if you're in an area where there's a lot of rain, or there is extra heat, or there's something that alters the way that metal is laid down there, that everything is put into place, then what you're going to see is a very different train track than something where they didn't have any of those challenges during that time. And that social contagion is what we're learning is something that alters the train tracks as you're developing your prefrontal cortex and your amygdala and trying to keep them separate.
Yeah. Okay. And then you talked a lot about adolescents, which is key because these are the groups that are probably most exposed. What about early childhood? I know that there's lots of studies that are showing a connection between the use of modern screen tech and media. Could you speak to that a little bit? The very early
So,
childhood?
very early childhood, before age 2, there really is no place for any kind of passive screen. Now, this doesn't mean you can't FaceTime your grandparents. In fact, you should do that. You should be reaching out to people that can interact, that can make eye contact, that can smile, that can imitate what that baby is doing, because that is something that promotes positive brain development. As they get over 2, even interactive types of games is something that is not negative. It's positive for kids. But passive screen time under age 2 has absolutely no place in that developing baby's brain. And in fact, we know that there is risk for speech delay, social emotional connection if you have kids that are really involved in passive screen time. This
Mm-hmm.
is, to me, is a very core thing that I talk about and try to bring it up in a sensitive way, because what will happen now is 20 years ago, when I had a child cry because I was going to come and look in their ears or they were getting ready to get a shot, you had that parent who had a book and they were pointing to things and they were looking at things in the room and they were making faces at them. Now they pull out their phone and put on a
Yeah.
video. And what I do is I will actually coach those parents to, okay, here's a book. Let's look at this particular page and point out the colors during the book and try to distract them that way. And
Mm-hmm.
when I have a parent that does that, I really congratulate them for doing that and for being that interactive coach with their child rather than bringing out a screen, because it's so prevalent nowadays.
Yeah, I mean, I get it. I'm a parent, pulling out that screen is very convenient, right? It's there. And I think most parents are well-intentioned, but I don't think
Absolutely.
that I don't think that they understand the downsides of using that screen as the pacifier, which is basically what you described, right?
Or
And
really the upsides of them being actively involved. I
right.
tell my parents that when they are doing things and playing and interacting with their child, I congratulate them. And I said, you are developing your baby's brain in a way
Yeah,
that I can't do. I mean,
yeah,
I'm a doctor, but you're the closest person to them. You're the parent. You are the person that is really going to make your child smart and intelligent and capable in this world. And it starts with that social emotional connection, you interacting with them.
yeah. And I think that the term that you're talking about, which we've talked a couple of other experts about, is serve and return, right? And
Yes, serve and
right.
return.
So it's this idea where if the child, even if they can't speak yet, points to something or smiles
Right.
at you, like they are learning from your reaction, right? And that is what is missing from modern screen tech. Yes, there's some interaction like you described and maybe some of the games, but it's just not the same. They're not getting the
Exactly.
nuance and that human connection that they're
Hmm.
learning from
Hmm.
without
It's
the serve
true.
and return.
Yes.
Okay. So again, I think we touched on this a little bit, but how does social media specifically now impact adolescents' wellness? So we covered a little bit about obesity. We covered a little bit about body image. Is there anything you can add to that when it comes to adolescents specifically?
Well, I think one of the things we touched on was the input from other people on things that are posted, on things that are liked, on sites that may be questionable.
Hmm.
Because what our researchers know is that affirmation or negativity is one of the things that really drives kids into looking more into an area that they really shouldn't look into, whether
Yeah.
it's drug abuse, whether it is anxiety, depression, whether it is body image type things. And and because of the way that the algorithms are set, that if somebody is very interested in, for example, an anorexia site, and they see some likes on there, that encourages them to want to look more at it. And the algorithms have it right there for them. The
Sure.
algorithms will make this more and more impactful. And so this is a thing that we know changes the brain of these adolescents. It wires those train tracks to go to places that they shouldn't be going, and that leads to anxiety and depression. This is
Mhm.
something that we know. It's really very, very evident in much of our brain research and the interaction of teens with these platforms.
Yeah, there's so much there. Um, one of our experts, we had a lot of conversations about like the mental health spectrum and
Yes.
how it is normal for kids this age in particular, because the mental health issues kind of start to emerge at this point,
Mhm.
to maybe feel a little bit sad, feel a little bit anxious, not feel
Yes.
great about their bodies. Like that's normal. But when they
Hmm.
get online onto social media, even if they linger for a second onto, I don't know, a piece of workout content, right? Where
Right.
maybe there's an unrealistic body standard. Now, that algorithm is going to, I mean, that first one might have been okay, but it's going to keep feeding them more and more of that type of content until it spirals down to probably the worst version of that content, right? So that's what curation
Absolutely.
does.
And with some of the programs and the filters, the bodies that they're seeing that are doing this exercising or doing these diets or doing these other plans are unrealistic bodies. And in fact, they're not real bodies. They are bodies that have been altered by AI to look, above something that one would think of as normal, but something that many of our adolescents look at and think are beautiful.
Right. And even if, and tell me if you agree with this, but even if they know it's not real, don't you think it affects them more so than an adult who
Absolutely.
knows it's not real just because of the way their
Absolutely.
brain is not
I
developed
mean,
fully?
these adolescents know that they can use one of these filters and make their bodies and hair and makeup look the same way or skin look the same way. It doesn't matter
Yeah.
because if they do that and then they get a bunch of likes from people, and this is really interesting, the likes need to come from people that are not your best friends, but people who are your acquaintances. It
Hmm.
seems to be much more impactful if you get likes from people that are, people you go to school with, but not your best friends. That seems to drive these teens into going on to the next step and looking at the next video or looking at the next exercise program or weight loss program or, anything that is really very questionable.
Interesting. I haven't heard that
Yeah.
before, but that does make a
Mhm.
lot of sense. And then I just wanted to touch again on something that you touched on, which is called the negative bias, right? When it
Yes.
comes to uh, online content. Again, we talked to one of our experts about this, and he said that there is research, and you probably are aware of this as well, that says that negative feelings actually linger longer in the brain, right? And that's for everybody, not just for kids. And unfortunately, again, because of the way these algorithms work, which optimizes for engagement, that cute puppy content may or may not, be the one that's going to get the most comments or likes or shares. It often tends to be content that's a little more outrageous, like
Right. Right.
people tend to fight more on social media than to put in positive comments, right? So
Absolutely.
that
Hmm.
allows for some of these more negative, more toxic pieces of content to rise to the top. So I think that's important to remember as well. On top of the
Well,
fact that these negative feelings are lingering longer in people's brains.
think about it this way. I mean, dopamine is somewhat of a fleeting neurotransmitter, and
Hmm.
that's what you get when you have the positive and the things that are really that you really like. If you think about epinephrine, norepinephrine, or fight or flight hormones,
Hmm.
those take a little bit longer to get out of your system. And what do they also do? They make your heart rate go up. They
Hmm.
sometimes make you a little bit sweaty. They sometimes make your stomach a little off, and they take a little bit longer to get out of your system. And those are the neurotransmitters that are associated with anxiety and later on depression. So
Hmm.
think about the chemicals that are there, how they affect your brain and how they affect the rest of your body. And you can see why it is that the happiness usually is shorter than the anxiety is.
Yeah. And I think you're touching on another point, which is content harm, right? Like
Right,
there is an actual harm to kids seeing content that is scary, violent, maybe overly sexual, for their age. And what I'm
right.
hearing over and over again from the experts is that manifests as anxiety primarily, but you mentioned depression as well. So
Correct. Yes. Hmm.
content can be harmful for
Hmm.
sure.
Hmm.
Okay, so let's talk about again back to the connection between physical health and social media. So, What do the latest studies say about that, about the connection between adolescents' mental and physical health and social media? Again, I think we covered it, but are there any studies
Well, I
that
think the recommendations really are looking at screen time for different ages. When
Mhm.
you're looking at 2 and under, it's only interactive with another individual, like FaceTime
Yeah.
with your grandparents. When you're looking at that early preschool age, there can be some interactive content, some of the games, particularly if they're reading or math or letters, that can actually be helpful. But you want to limit to 1 to 2 hours a day.
Mhm.
When you're getting into school age should still also be that content should be there with an adult. There's not any recommendation to have a child have a phone on their own until really late middle school, 13,
Mhm.
14, eighth grade. And before that, content should be moderated by an adult, and there should be discussions there about around it. For all of those ages, including teenagers, there should be a limit on the time of contact. And it looks like 2 hours is the most that anybody should be on a phone.
Mhm.
And that there should be no phone use 1 to 2 hours before sleep. Optimally 2 hours, 1 hour if needed, because kids are working with each other on homework projects and things. But the thing is that if you think about your own brain chemistry and melatonin comes in when it starts to get dark. And if it's dark and you're on a screen, you are negating the whole effect of melatonin. So this is why we say stop the screens at least an hour, preferably 2 hours before that child goes to bed, because we didn't mention sleep and mental health, but sleep
Yeah.
is one of those things that doesn't happen when you've got a kid on a screen.
Yeah, and everything you just described, and I think you covered everything from like screen time recommendations to sleep to smartphone introduction. But the sleep epidemic is huge. There are
It is.
definitely plenty of studies that even I'm aware of that correlate, screen time and kind of a decline
Mm-hmm.
of sleep. I believe
Mm-hmm.
there's one that even says, uh, like if even the presence of the phone inside of your room, like on your nightstand or just even in the room in general can interfere with sleep, even if you're not using it. I'm sure you're familiar with that one as
It
well.
can. I mean, this is why the American Academy of Pediatrics in their family media plan recommends that there is a central place like a kitchen where
Yeah.
phones are charged, that they are not kept in the bedroom.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's huge. And that's a relatively simple tip that I think
Yes.
most families can implement
Hmm.
without a whole lot of drama or pushback, right?
Right.
And then the other thing you talked about, which I'm really glad you touched on, because I think a lot of people are hesitant to put like an age recommendation for smartphone introduction, but I am hearing more and more 13, 14 being the kind of consensus for the very, very earliest of
Very
even
lowest. Yes.
yeah,
Hmm.
even introducing talk and text, even. And I'm
Yes.
hearing for social media, it's starting to be 16 plus as the
I would
consensus.
agree. I
Yeah,
would agree
yeah,
that 16 plus is really what you're looking at for social media, because you have that piece of that social interaction and the social contagion, as you mentioned, that
yeah.
comes in there. And that below age 16, our brains are developing at a pace where that really is quite disruptive to them.
Yeah, I mean, I've been saying this and I know I didn't make this up, but I think that having access to social media and a smartphone, which is a supercomputer in your pocket, is as much responsibility, if not more, than driving a car. When we say age 16 is the
Absolutely.
age we
Hmm.
let kids drive cars as well.
Right.
So, and then the last thing I'll add to that, because you mentioned limiting time, that is also a consensus with all of our contributing experts. I believe last year there was a study, and I know there's probably more than one, that correlates less smartphone use with higher mental health outcomes. So all of this is being studied. It's new, right? And I do remind people, like especially the parents and our parent eds, that this is a brand new societal issue. Even though it feels like we've had these things forever, the
Right.
iPhone didn't even come out until 2007. It probably didn't even get adopted till 2008. And at the
Right.
time, we didn't even have video capabilities. That came, I
Exactly.
believe, like
Hmm.
years later. So
Hmm.
we're not going to override all of these things that we've been adapted to do in our brains in 15 years, right?
Mhm.
So the studies are also emerging, but there are more and more of them that are coming out all the time.
I
So
tell people to think of it like food and junk food. I mean,
yeah,
we have a lot of food. We've got a lot of junk food that's out there. Some
yeah,
social media is actually positive, but there's a lot of junk food out there.
yeah,
And you can't legislate away junk food. You can't say you
yeah,
never can have this. You've got to learn how to have it. When is it the right time to let a kid go into McDonald's by themselves? It's not age
yeah,
7. It's
yeah.
maybe when they're 16, 17, they know what to do with it. So it's very similar to that. It is really looking at where that balance is so that it can be an entertaining factor, it can be a connection factor, but it isn't disruptive in ways that we know it is.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the food metaphor. We use it all the time, especially when we're
Mm.
teaching the kids, because I think it's so useful.
Yeah.
You know, definitely, aside from maybe some educational apps and things like that, most of what we're doing on our devices is it's a little bit like sugar, right? We all have sugar,
It's a whole
probably,
lot
but
like sugar. Yeah. Hmm.
yeah, but first of all, they both elevate dopamine, so that's a good
Hmm.
uh, connector there. But we can also agree that maybe sugar is something we should limit a little bit more, right,
Hmm.
than
Yeah.
vegetables. So
Yeah.
it's a really simple way of looking at it. And like you said, um, we can't. Technology's here. We're not going to get rid of it, right? So
Right.
we just need to find out how we can
Learn
have a
how to live with
healthier
it.
relationship
Yeah.
with it. And when we teach kids about brain science, like I liken it to teaching them about the food groups, right? Like you're not
Hmm.
necessarily telling them what to eat, but you're giving them kind of a foundation. I believe kids can make good choices if you give
Right.
them that
Hmm.
information. And food is a great metaphor. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Well,
So
thank you.
okay. So, lastly, my last question is what does the latest data and studies tell us about the relationship between smartphone introduction age for kids and mental and physical health? So, you touched on your recommendation being not till 13, 14 at the earliest, but and then we mentioned the one study that correlates less smartphone use with higher mental health outcomes. But is there anything else you could add to that?
Well, I think that where the studies are coming into consensus is the 2-hour time limit a day,
Mhm.
looking at age 13, 14 for introduction, but limiting social media until after age 16.
Okay.
That there, with social media content, um, what we know is that if a child begins to go down the rabbit hole of a certain algorithm, that this is something where parents need to be talking to them and tell them that this may happen. If it does, let me know. And
Hmm.
that we can still have some parental anticipatory guidance and that interaction with that child that is not smartphone based, that's going to be helpful. We know
Hmm.
that media free times with families are really important. So
Mm.
make the dinner table a media free time. We know
Mhm.
that sleep, 1 to 2 hours before sleep, you should be off, and that the phones should be kept in an area that is not a bedroom. So these are all things that we know that are of good guidance. And again, this is brain health. This is brain health as much as taking a nutritional supplement, as much as going to school, as much as you're doing with education. Smartphone use and limiting social media and knowing the right amounts of time and the right amounts of content are something that's going to help build brains.
Yeah. I don't envy parents. I know it's very
Mhm.
overwhelming.
Yeah.
And I know a lot about this topic and I still find it overwhelming. And
Hmm.
but I think keeping it simple to those guidelines that you recommended is super, super helpful. Like
Right.
just knowing time limits work, phones out of bedroom, just kind of those basic things. I think everybody can at least follow those recommendations. And again, I'm just glad to hear you kind of take that stand on the age limit because I think up until very recently we've been afraid to do this for some reason. We've
Yeah.
we've always said this
Yeah.
is a very individual issue, but we have to have some rules of thumb, right? I mean, maybe some kids are ready earlier or later, but there are guidelines for a reason, right? Even within the Academy of Pediatrics on screen time. Obviously, one size might not always fit all, but people
But you
want
know
and
your
need
child,
guidance.
and it's like letting them out into the world alone. You
Yeah.
know that there's some good things that they'll learn, that we know that there's some dangers out there as well
Yeah.
too. And recognizing when the appropriate age is and really the appropriate developmental status of your child for walking to their friend's house or riding a bike
Yeah.
to a friend's house or staying out until after 9 o'clock at night. These are all things that we have recommendations for because we know that our kids' brains are developing. And social media is just as much a jungle as the world out there. And so
Yeah.
they're great things to learn. There are things that we have to warn against.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Kraft, for your time. I really appreciate all your really pragmatic tips, obviously your knowledge of all the research and everything else. So thank you so much again.
Well, you're very welcome. And thank you for the interview.